Russian President Putin says he's pulled back some of his troops from the Ukrainian border, and he's ready to resume dialogue with the West. Can war be averted, or is bloodshed, death, and oil and gas shortages on the horizon? Well, joining us to explain is Harry Kazianis. Mr. Kazianis is Senior Director of the Center for the National Interest. Harry, it's always good to talk with you and learn your thoughts on this time. So is Joe Biden pushing us to a showdown with Russia over Ukraine? Is he right to be doing so?
Well, I think he's right to be concerned, and I do give the president some credit here in that he's trying to do as much as he can to avert war. But in this instance, it's Vladimir Putin who I think gets the deciding vote. I mean, there's 150,000 troops amassed on the Ukrainian border. He's essentially surrounded Ukraine. And Putin has a decision to make. I mean, he's claimed that he's withdrawn some forces, which, to be honest with you, looking at what satellite imagery we have, I think it's very clear he's lying. Actually, the Soviet Union used to play that game before in Afghanistan. They would announce these troop withdrawals, and everybody knew they were fake. So this is an old Russian game that's sort of been thrown around. But Putin really has to make a decision. The ground will start to thaw in about a week to 2 weeks, and Russian armor will not be able to go steaming rolling across Ukraine. So if Putin's going to move, it will be within the next few days. That much is certain.
And although considered to be a U.S. ally, Ukraine is not a NATO member. You work for an organization called Center for National Interest. So the United States is taking a lead role in this dispute. Is that in the American national interest? Why or why not?
Well, I think it is. I think we don't want to necessarily, spill American blood and treasure and put troops in Ukraine or anything like that. But I do think history does show when you let an aggressor like Vladimir Putin just cut countries apart, take pieces of territory they want, damage economies, hold the world hostage the way they are, countries will keep doing that over and over again. And I mean, a lot of people invoke the China-Taiwan scenario where, if Russia is allowed to do this, then Xi Jinping could do the same thing to Taiwan or other countries, or maybe take over the South China Sea or other parts of the world. So I think it's important that we have to stand up to aggression, but that doesn't always necessarily mean the United States needs to put troops on the ground. We don't want to get into any more forever wars, which is the popular DC term that's thrown around. So I think it's important that we stand up to these dictators, but I think it's also important that our European allies are there to help and make sure that they are the backstop, and also that we give Ukraine the military equipment that it needs to defend itself. So it doesn't always have to be America, doing everything, but it is important for us to lead. There's nobody else to do it, to be frank.
How big of a crisis is this, in your opinion, Harry? The Ukrainian president has downplayed the threat. Zelensky knows the Russians have been moving troops all along the border ever since they invaded and annexed Crimea in 2014. And instead of Ukrainians asking them to hunker down into the safety of their homes, he sent them out in the streets for a national holiday, a day of unity. Now, that doesn't sound like someone who fears an invasion to me. What do you think?
Well, he has to downplay. I mean, the Ukrainians are hopeful in the next 5 to 10 years that they could join NATO, that they could integrate in the European Union. I mean, that is essentially their dream. They want to be part of the West. And I can't blame them. They would never want to rejoin Russia. That would be a basket case. But I think for the Ukrainians, they don't want to lose any investments that are coming into the country. They don't want to look like a basket case.
I know you've studied Putin. He's a pretty smart man. If he wants to win assurances that Ukraine will not be allowed to join NATO, also stop NATO military exercises near his border, prevent Western missiles from being put in place nearby, you wouldn't invade Ukraine and actually create the situation you're trying to prevent, would you?
No, I think Russia's being very foolish here. I mean, the Russians have always had this fear that NATO is their adversary, NATO is their enemy. And it's actually a lot of the things that Russia has done over the last 10 or 15 years that are pushing all these different countries to join NATO, whether it's the Baltics, Poland, whether it's the Baltic states literally tripling their defense expenditures over the last 5 to 7 years, Poland buying the F-35, talk of Finland now joining NATO and buying the F-35. All of these things don't come in isolation. They're because the Russians, for what they did in Georgia back in 2008, what they did to Ukraine back in 2014, taking Crimea, and now ratcheting up tensions all over again. So if Russia wants to disincentivize countries from joining NATO, maybe it should stop to think about what it's actually doing.
Okay, so quickly, Harry, what's likely to happen here?
Well, I think what's going to happen is I think there is going to be some sort of diplomatic off-ramp. I think both sides are going to maybe agree to disagree. Maybe Ukraine says, look, we're not going to join NATO right now, but we're not going to, hold back in the future. My hope is that that could be, a way that both sides could essentially come back from the brink. But if Putin doesn't like that, if Putin doesn't take a sort of temporary guarantee, he may decide to just launch a lightning strike in Ukraine for maybe 5 to 10 days, massive military bombardment, lots of missiles, lots of tanks, go maybe 20, 30 miles into the country, do as much damage as they can. So, Ukraine for a decade or more is basically untouchable by NATO and the EU. But we'll have to see. I think those are the two most likely scenarios.
Okay, some good insights there, Harry. Center for the National Interest Senior Director, Harry Kazianis, thank you for providing those insights.
Thanks for having me.